The day had started like any other, with the warm sun climbing slowly over the horizon and spilling its light over the quiet streets of the neighborhood. The mansion, a tall and elegant structure surrounded by trimmed hedges and a perfectly manicured lawn, stood in the middle of it all, like a jewel. The protagonist had spent years building their life, working hard to achieve the comfort and success that now surrounded them. The house, big and full of memories, was usually a place of peace. But today it felt strange, almost foreign. They had planned to come back late from a short trip, just enough to avoid the early morning chaos that often seemed to follow their life like a shadow. The trip had been meant to be relaxing, a break from emails, calls, and the constant responsibility of managing everything in their busy world. However, plans sometimes change, and today, they had to return earlier than expected. There was a small thrill in the thought of getting home sooner than planned, of stepping back into the familiar comfort of the mansion. As they approached the driveway, they noticed something unusual. Footprints in the freshly watered garden led toward the front door, something that had not been there when they left. The flowers in the border beds looked slightly disturbed, petals bent in a way that suggested someone had walked through them recently. There was a faint sound of movement inside the house, almost like a whisper of life that didn't belong to anyone living there. For a moment, they thought maybe they were imagining things. After all, the mansion was huge, with many rooms and corners, and shadows often played tricks on the eyes. But the feeling in their gut told them otherwise. There was someone in their house, and they were not alone. The protagonist had always known about the strict HOA rules in the neighborhood. The community was well kept and orderly, and many neighbors took their responsibilities seriously. But there was always one person who seemed to take it too far. People called her Karen. She was known for policing the neighborhood, reporting even the smallest deviations from the HOA regulations. Over the years, there had been several minor confrontations, usually about small things like parking, trash bins, or holiday decorations. Karen was the kind of person who thrived on control, someone who seemed to believe she had authority over everyone else's life. The protagonist had encountered her before, and it was always unpleasant. Her tone was sharp, her judgment quick, and her sense of entitlement clear. But they had never imagined that her curiosity and overzealous nature would lead her this far. There was no reason for her to be inside the mansion, and yet the signs were unmistakable. The protagonist's mind raced through possibilities. Was it a neighbor, a delivery mistake, or something more sinister? Slowly, they reached for the keys in their pocket, their hands steady despite the tension. The driveway felt longer than usual, every step echoing against the quiet walls of the neighborhood. They unlocked the front door and paused, listening carefully. There it was again, the faint sound of someone moving inside. It was deliberate, careful, almost casual, like someone who believed they had every right to be there. The protagonist pushed the door open and stepped inside, taking in the familiar scent of the house mingled with something strange, a hint of another presence. The living room looked almost normal, but there were subtle signs that someone had been there. A cushion on the couch was slightly out of place, the curtains had been adjusted differently, and there was a faint impression on the carpet where someone had apparently walked. They moved further into the house, each step careful, listening for any movement that could give away the intruder's position. It was in the kitchen that they first saw her. Karen, standing near the island, holding a cup of the protagonist's favorite coffee mug as if it was perfectly natural for her to be there. Her expression was calm, almost smug, like she had expected this moment to happen. When she saw the protagonist, she didn't panic or flee. Instead, she tilted her head slightly and gave a small, knowing smile. "I just wanted to make sure everything was okay," she said, her tone light, but with an edge that made it clear she believed she was entitled to explanation or discussion. The protagonist froze for a moment, unsure whether to react with anger, disbelief, or a calm approach. They knew that confronting her directly could escalate the situation quickly. Karen had a tendency to blow things out of proportion, to call authorities over minor disagreements, and to create chaos from small issues. But there was also a part of the protagonist that wanted to assert control, to make it clear that this behavior was unacceptable. They took a deep breath and spoke firmly. "You are in my house without permission. You need to leave immediately." Karen's smile didn't falter. "I have every right to check on the property. After all, it's important to make sure the neighborhood is maintained properly. You can't expect someone to just let everything slide. The protagonist's patience was tested. They had always tried to remain reasonable, even when dealing with difficult neighbors, but this crossed the line. The house, their sanctuary, had been invaded, and yet they knew that any rash action could make the situation worse. So they did the one thing that felt both practical and strategic. They started documenting everything. Photos, videos, timestamps. Every movement Karen made, every word she said was recorded carefully, silently, as if building a shield for themselves. Karen, meanwhile, seemed oblivious to the tension she had created. She moved around the kitchen, opened cupboards, checked the fridge, and left little passive-aggressive notes on the counter. It was clear that she wanted to assert some kind of control, to leave her mark and to make the protagonist feel uncomfortable. And yet, despite the absurdity, there was a strange humor in the situation. The idea that someone could so casually invade a mansion, rearrange things, and act as if it were their own home was almost surreal. The protagonist tried to reason with her, but it was like talking to a wall. Karen had made up her mind, and logic seemed irrelevant to her sense of entitlement. Every attempt at conversation was met with just enough politeness to seem reasonable, but not enough to actually solve the problem. It was clear that this was going to be a long, drawn-out situation. As the hours passed, the protagonist settled into a strange routine. They moved around the house, careful to avoid direct confrontation, while keeping a close eye on Karen. She seemed to adapt quickly, making herself comfortable, using the space as if she belonged there. The mansion, usually a place of solitude and peace, now felt like a stage for a bizarre power struggle. Evening came, and the sunlight faded into the golden glow of the mansion's interior lights. The protagonist thought about their neighbors, about the usual quiet of the community, and about the absurdity of dealing with someone who had turned a 2-minute intrusion into a full-scale invasion of privacy. They reflected on past encounters with difficult people, realizing that patience, strategy, and careful observation were often more powerful than anger or confrontation. By nightfall, they had a plan forming in their mind. They wouldn't rush. They wouldn't give Karen the satisfaction of seeing them flustered. They would handle this carefully, strategically, and with the calm authority that came from knowing the truth. Karen might think she had the upper hand, but the protagonist had something far more important: knowledge, patience, and a clear understanding of how to reclaim control of their own home. The mansion, though invaded, still belonged to them. And as they prepared to face whatever absurdities Karen would throw next, they knew one thing for certain: this was far from over. The tension, the uncertainty, and the unusual dynamics of having someone living in their home without permission had only just begun. And while Karen believed she was the one in charge, the protagonist quietly smiled, ready for the next move, knowing that the story was just starting to unfold. The next morning, the mansion felt heavy with a tension that could be felt in every corner. Sunlight streamed through the large windows, but the warmth did nothing to lighten the atmosphere. Karen had spent the night in the house, apparently unbothered by the presence of the actual owner. She was in the living room, scrolling through the protagonist's tablet, occasionally humming softly, as if the house had somehow become her own. The protagonist stood at the edge of the room, watching, feeling a mix of disbelief and frustration. They had seen difficult neighbors before, but nothing like this. Karen's confidence seemed limitless, and she moved through the house with the air of someone entirely at ease. It was a boldness that defied logic. The protagonist had worked hard to earn their space, and now someone else was claiming it brazenly and without permission. They took a deep breath and reminded themselves to stay calm. Any sudden reaction could give Karen the power to spin the situation against them, but patience would be their ally. Karen finally noticed them standing there. She looked up, smiled faintly, and said, "I thought you might be upset, but honestly, this house is amazing. I just wanted to make sure everything is running smoothly while you were gone." The words were casual, but the undertone was clear. She expected admiration, or at least a lack of resistance. "You are not supposed to be here," the protagonist said firmly, stepping closer. "I don't care about your opinions on maintenance. This is my home. You need to leave." Their voice carried calm authority, the kind that demanded attention yet avoided unnecessary conflict. Karen tilted her head and shrugged, a gesture that seemed practiced. "I'm not leaving. I'm just keeping an eye on things. You know, making sure the neighborhood standards are upheld. After all, someone has to do it, right? She leaned against the counter, folding her arms in a casual, almost playful manner. The protagonist felt a flicker of anger but pushed it aside. They knew that confrontation alone wouldn't work. Karen thrived on conflict, and any sign of emotional reaction would only fuel her behavior. Instead, they focused on observation. Every movement, every word, every little action Karen took would be documented. Evidence was power, and this was the moment to gather as much as possible. Over the course of the morning, Karen explored more of the house. She opened cabinets, examined the artwork, and occasionally adjusted something to her liking. Each time she moved, the protagonist followed quietly, making notes and taking pictures discreetly. It was surreal. How could someone act so entitled, so confident in another person's home? Neighbors came and went, curious about the mansion's unusual activity. Some called to check in, assuming the protagonist might need help or support. They were shocked when they learned Karen had been living there without permission. Many offered to intervene, but the protagonist politely declined. This wasn't a matter for others yet. They wanted to handle it carefully, strategically, and without escalating into unnecessary drama. Karen, sensing she had an audience, became more brazen. She started using the kitchen appliances, made herself snacks, and even left a few personal items around, like a scarf draped over a chair and a book on the coffee table. The protagonist observed everything, noting how Karen's behavior was not just intrusive but deliberate. She wanted to mark her presence, to leave evidence that she had been there in control. Despite the stress, the protagonist found moments of quiet humor in the situation. The absurdity of someone living in their mansion, acting as if it were her own, made them shake their head and laugh quietly to themselves. Life had thrown them into a scenario that was bizarre, almost like a story one would read online but never imagine experiencing personally. Humor became a coping mechanism, helping them stay grounded and focused. Throughout the day, Karen tried to engage the protagonist in conversation, testing boundaries and pushing buttons. She spoke about neighborhood rules, about other residents, and even about things the protagonist had never shared with anyone. It was clear that she had been observing, possibly eavesdropping, and using the information to create a sense of familiarity and authority. The protagonist responded calmly, answering only when necessary and keeping the upper hand in every verbal exchange. By midday, the tension in the house had settled into a strange rhythm. Karen moved about freely, confident in her presence, while the protagonist maintained quiet vigilance, documenting and planning. Each interaction, each subtle challenge was part of a larger psychological game. Karen wanted to unsettle them, to dominate the space, but the protagonist refused to give her that satisfaction. They realized that Karen's actions were driven by more than just curiosity. She craved control, recognition, and a sense of superiority. Understanding this allowed the protagonist to anticipate her moves and stay one step ahead. They could let her believe she was in charge while secretly building the case to reclaim their home fully. Afternoon faded into evening, and Karen finally settled in the living room with a cup of coffee. She glanced at the protagonist and smiled, a hint of mischief in her eyes. You don't have to be so serious all the time. I'm just trying to help." The words were light, but the message was heavy. She was testing limits, measuring responses, and gauging reactions. The protagonist, however, remained composed. They took a seat across from her, calmly sipping their own coffee, and watched. Every gesture, every glance, every word was a piece of the puzzle. They were learning, observing, and preparing for the next phase. Karen might have believed she had control, but the protagonist knew otherwise. Patience and strategy were on their side, and the upper hand would come in time. Night fell, casting long shadows across the mansion. The house, though invaded, still held the essence of the protagonist's life, memories, and hard work. Karen might have been a temporary guest, but she could not erase what was theirs. The protagonist reflected on the events of the day, feeling a mix of relief and determination. Relief that they had stayed calm and composed, and determination to see the situation through with intelligence and precision. They thought about what the next day might bring. Karen would continue to push boundaries, but the protagonist was ready. They would continue documenting, observing, and planning. Every action would be calculated, every response measured. The mansion was theirs, and they would reclaim it fully, not with anger or aggression, but with patience, strategy, and a quiet, unwavering authority. As they prepared for sleep, they glanced around the mansion, noting the subtle signs of Karen's presence, but also recognizing the strength in maintaining control. It had been a long day, filled with tension, absurdity, and unexpected challenges, but they had learned something important. Calm observation, careful planning, and strategic patience were more powerful than any outburst or confrontation. And with that knowledge, they could face whatever came next, confident in their ability to restore peace and reclaim their home fully. The following morning, the mansion seemed to hum with an unusual energy. The protagonist woke early, as was their habit, and moved quietly through the rooms. Karen was already awake, sitting in the sunroom, flipping through a magazine with a look of calm satisfaction. She greeted them with a casual nod, as if the previous confrontations had been nothing more than a brief misunderstanding. The protagonist, however, knew better. The stakes had grown higher, and the intrusion was no longer a simple annoyance. It was a test of patience, strategy, and composure. Karen moved about the mansion with the same confidence as the day before. She seemed to believe that familiarity had earned her a right to the space, that her constant presence made her part of the household. The protagonist observed quietly, taking note of every detail. Her habits, her routines, the way she touched items, adjusted furniture, or rearranged personal effects. All of it painted a picture of someone who craved control and validation. Breakfast passed without major words. Karen had taken liberties with the kitchen, preparing coffee exactly the way the protagonist liked it, and placing it on the counter as if it were her thoughtful gesture. The protagonist took the coffee without comment, silently noting the audacity of the action. It was small, subtle, and deliberate, enough to provoke irritation but not enough to justify an outburst. They knew that restraint was the most effective tool here. As the morning unfolded, Karen explored more of the mansion. She moved into the library, opened drawers, and shuffled books on shelves. She commented on the decor, and even offered unsolicited opinions on where furniture should be placed. Every word and movement was carefully observed by the protagonist, who took notes discreetly on their tablet. This documentation was essential. It was the foundation of a case that would eventually restore order without unnecessary confrontation. Neighbors occasionally stopped by, curious about activity in the mansion. Some had seen Karen coming and going, and they whispered amongst themselves. Many were shocked that she had overstayed her welcome, living there without permission. Others were intrigued, curious to see how the protagonist would handle such an unusual situation. The protagonist remained composed, speaking politely but firmly, never revealing panic or frustration. Their calmness contrasted sharply with Karen's intrusive behavior, further highlighting the absurdity of her actions. Karen, sensing she had an audience, seemed to grow bolder. She moved through rooms as if she belonged, leaving small personal items behind. A scarf on a chair, a book open on a desk, a small note suggesting improvements to household arrangements. The protagonist watched everything, carefully building a record of her presence and behavior. It was almost like playing a game of chess, each move anticipated, each response calculated. By midday, the tension had shifted. Karen began to reveal more of her personality. She was not just intrusive. She was possessive, obsessive even. She seemed fascinated by the routines of the household, the way the protagonist organized their life, and even the subtle habits that made the mansion feel like a home. It was clear she was obsessed with control and validation, wanting to leave her mark while demonstrating perceived authority. Understanding this allowed the protagonist to plan their next steps strategically. The afternoon brought new challenges. Karen attempted to provoke conversation, asking questions about personal matters, commenting on lifestyle choices, and occasionally making subtle criticisms. The protagonist responded calmly, carefully controlling the dialogue to avoid escalation. Each interaction became an exercise in patience and psychological awareness. Karen believed she was testing boundaries, but in reality, the protagonist was learning, observing, and planning. During one particularly tense moment, Karen picked up a photograph from the hallway table and examined it closely. It was a family photo, a simple memory from a special day. Karen's eyes lingered, and she made a comment about how the space could be improved or arranged differently. The protagonist felt a surge of protective instinct but restrained themselves, noting every detail and preparing for a strategic response later. They realized that letting her think she had influence while quietly maintaining control would be far more effective than confrontation. By evening, Karen had settled into a strange routine. She moved confidently through the mansion, performed small tasks as if she were part of the household, and occasionally left notes offering advice or suggestions. The protagonist observed, took notes, and reflected. Humor became a coping mechanism once again, helping them manage the absurdity of someone living in their home without permission. The situation was frustrating, but it also highlighted the protagonist's patience, intelligence, and ability to handle extreme circumstances with composure. Neighbors started to notice patterns, whispering about Karen's continued presence. Some were concerned, offering to call authorities, while others were entertained by the unfolding drama. The protagonist politely declined external intervention, determined to handle the matter internally and strategically. They knew that overreaction could backfire, giving Karen an opportunity to manipulate the situation further. As night approached, the protagonist reviewed the day's observations. Every note, photo, and video was carefully organized, creating a clear record of Karen's behavior. They recognized patterns, predicted her next moves, and planned responses that would assert control without provoking unnecessary conflict. The mansion, though invaded, remained their domain. Patience, strategy, and calm observation had become the tools of reclaiming authority. Finally, as the mansion settled into quiet, the protagonist felt a renewed sense of determination. Karen might have believed she was in control, but the truth was different. Every action she took, every attempt at dominance was documented and understood. The protagonist was ready for the next phase, prepared to reclaim their space thoughtfully, strategically, and effectively. They reflected on the lessons of the day, the importance of patience, the power of observation, and the value of strategic thinking. Life sometimes placed people in absurd, challenging situations, but composure and intelligence were stronger than chaos and intrusion. As they prepared for sleep, they glanced around the mansion, noting the signs of Karen's presence but also the strength that came from quiet control. The story was far from over, but the protagonists knew they were ready to face whatever came next with calm authority and careful planning. By the fourth day, the mansion had become a place of quiet tension, a battlefield of patience and strategy. The protagonist awoke early as usual, moving silently through the hallways. Karen was already active, making herself breakfast in the kitchen as if she had lived there for years. The protagonist watched from the doorway, noting how seamlessly she moved through the space, and yet mentally cataloging each intrusion, each overstep. It was becoming clear that Karen's presence was more than just curiosity or meddling. She'd been observing the mansion, the routines, and even the protagonist's habits in detail. Each subtle action she took was meant to assert a sense of control, to make the space hers in spirit, if not in legality. The protagonist realized that understanding her motives would be crucial to regaining authority over their home. They approached her calmly, coffee in hand, speaking with measured tones. "You need to leave," they said. "This is my home, and I cannot allow you to stay here without permission." Karen looked up, unfazed, and gave a faint, knowing smile. "I'm just trying to help," she said. "You're so busy, and someone has to make sure things are done right." Her tone was casual, but there was a clear edge, a sense of entitlement that was hard to ignore. The protagonist remained calm, recognizing that confrontation alone would not work. Karen thrived on conflict, on the subtle manipulation of perception. Instead, they focused on observation, documentation, and strategic patience. Every note, photo, and video taken over the past days had been carefully organized, creating a clear record of Karen's behavior. This would be their strength in the coming days. Karen spent the morning exploring further. She moved into the study, rearranging books, adjusting the chair, and even touching personal items that had sentimental value. The protagonist followed discreetly, noting her patterns. Karen's actions were deliberate and repetitive, showing a need for control and recognition. She seemed almost obsessed with the order of the house, the routines, and the small details that made the mansion a home. Throughout the day, the protagonist observed and reflected. Humor became an important tool, helping to cope with the absurdity of the situation. They could not believe that someone had managed to live in their mansion, using their belongings and acting with a sense of entitlement. Yet they also recognized the lessons in patience, strategic thinking, and calm resilience. Karen attempted to engage in conversation, testing boundaries and subtly provoking responses. She asked questions about personal matters, commented on lifestyle choices, and offered unsolicited advice. The protagonist responded calmly, controlling every interaction, refusing to give her the satisfaction of a reaction. This careful balance of composure and observation was slowly shifting the dynamic, allowing them to maintain quiet control. By mid-afternoon, the protagonist discovered more about Karen's motives. She was not just intrusive. She was jealous and possessive. Her interest in the mansion, in the routines, and even in the protagonist's life indicated a deeper obsession. She wanted validation, recognition, and a sense of superiority over someone she considered her equal or rival. Understanding this allowed the protagonist to anticipate her moves, plan responses, and maintain control without confrontation. Karen grew bolder, leaving subtle marks of her presence. A note suggesting changes to the kitchen layout, a rearranged bookshelf, a small decorative item moved slightly. Each action was a message, a test of boundaries. The protagonist documented everything meticulously, knowing that evidence was their most powerful weapon. Every move Karen made added to a growing record that would ultimately help reclaim the mansion. Neighbors had begun to notice the unusual situation. Whispers spread about Karen's continued presence in the mansion, and opinions varied. Some were concerned, suggesting authorities intervene, while others were entertained by the bizarre scenario. The protagonist politely declined outside involvement, determined to resolve the situation strategically, maintaining authority and patience. By evening, the mansion had settled into a tense routine. Karen moved confidently, yet the protagonist remained vigilant, documenting, observing, and reflecting. Each interaction, each subtle challenge, became part of a larger psychological strategy. Karen believed she had control, but the protagonist knew better. Their calmness, patience, and meticulous attention to detail were quietly asserting dominance. Late at night, the protagonist reviewed the accumulated evidence. Notes, photographs, and videos created an unassailable record of Karen's behavior. The patterns of her intrusion, her attempts at dominance, and her obsession with control were now clear. They planned the next steps, confident that the situation would soon be resolved. Karen's sense of entitlement and overconfidence would ultimately be her undoing. As they prepared for sleep, the protagonist reflected on the events of the day. Karen's motives were now clear, her behavior predictable, and their own strategy solidified. Patience, calm observation, and careful documentation were more powerful than anger or confrontation. The mansion, though temporarily invaded, remained theirs. The next move would be decisive, and the protagonist was ready to restore full control, using intelligence, strategy, and composure. The fifth day dawned with a quiet tension that filled every corner of the mansion. The protagonist had spent the previous days observing, documenting, and planning, and now it was time to bring the situation to a close. Karen, unaware of the meticulous record being kept, moved through the house with her usual confidence, completely oblivious to the fact that the balance of power was quietly shifting. The protagonist began the day calmly, making breakfast as if nothing unusual had happened. Karen watched, occasionally making comments about how she would have done things differently. Each comment was a test, a small attempt to assert authority, but the protagonist ignored the provocations, maintaining composure and focus. They knew that reacting emotionally would only give Karen the satisfaction of influence. After breakfast, the protagonist subtly gathered all the documentation accumulated over the past days. Photos, videos, notes, and timestamps had been carefully organized, creating a clear and undeniable record of Karen's actions. The sheer weight of evidence would make it impossible for her to claim innocence or justify her behavior. The protagonist reviewed everything quietly, mentally rehearsing how they would confront her and assert control. Karen, oblivious to the preparation, continued her routine. She explored rooms, rearranged items, and left subtle notes suggesting improvements to the mansion's layout. Each action was designed to provoke, to test the protagonist's patience, and to demonstrate her perceived authority. But the protagonist remained calm, observing silently, allowing Karen to reveal her motives and weaknesses through her own behavior. As the afternoon approached, the protagonist decided it was time to confront Karen directly. They approached her in the living room, where she was sitting comfortably, sipping coffee and flipping through one of the protagonist's magazines. The calmness in their voice contrasted sharply with the tension in the room. "Karen," they began, "I have been patient and have allowed you to remain in my home, but this has gone far enough. You are here without permission, and your actions over the past days are unacceptable. I have documented everything. There is clear evidence of your trespassing and intrusion into my personal space." They placed the organized folder of photos, videos, and notes on the table in front of her, each piece meticulously labeled. Karen looked at the folder, her expression shifting from casual confidence to disbelief. She flipped through the pages, skimming the photos and notes, realizing that her actions had been fully recorded. She tried to speak, to explain herself, but the protagonist held up a hand, signaling that they would not be interrupted. "You believed you could assert control and claim a sense of authority here, but the truth is different. Your actions have consequences, and I will not allow anyone to undermine my home or my peace. This ends now." The words were calm, firm, and unyielding, leaving no room for argument. Karen's demeanor faltered. The audacity she had shown for days crumbled under the weight of undeniable evidence. She attempted to justify her presence, to suggest that she had only been trying to help, but the protagonist remained unmoved. Each excuse was met with a quiet, steady refusal to accept her claims. The balance of power had shifted completely. Realizing that she had no leverage, Karen finally agreed to leave. The protagonist escorted her to the front door, maintaining composure and authority. Karen lingered for a moment, perhaps trying to regain some sense of control, but the protagonist's calm presence left no room for manipulation. She stepped outside, the door closing behind her with a definitive click that symbolized the end of her intrusion. The mansion felt immediately lighter, the tension that had filled the air for days dissipating. The protagonist moved through the rooms, checking for any remaining signs of intrusion, and restored the house to its rightful order. Each item returned to its proper place, each surface wiped clean, and the sense of peace gradually returned. Neighbors who had been observing the situation cautiously approached, offering support and congratulations. They expressed relief that the situation had been resolved without conflict, and admiration for the protagonist's patience and strategic thinking. The protagonist accepted the gestures graciously, understanding that the outcome was the result of careful planning and composure, rather than luck or force. In the days that followed, the protagonist reflected on the experience. Karen's intrusion had been disruptive, absurd, and frustrating, but it had also been a lesson in patience, observation, and strategic thinking. They had learned the power of calm composure in the face of provocation, the importance of documenting evidence, and the strength that comes from maintaining control without resorting to anger or confrontation. The mansion, once again a sanctuary, now held a new sense of security. The protagonist had reclaimed their home fully, not through force or aggression, but through intelligence, patience, and careful planning. Karen's attempt to assert control had failed completely, and the protagonist emerged from the experience stronger and more confident in their ability to handle extreme situations with grace and composure. As they walked through the house one evening, the warm light casting gentle shadows across familiar spaces, they reflected on the absurdity and the intensity of the past days. Life sometimes placed people in situations that tested patience and intelligence, but it was in these moments that true resilience and strength were revealed. The protagonist smiled quietly, grateful for their own composure and strategic thinking, knowing that they had turned a bizarre, intrusive challenge into a story of victory and calm authority. The courtroom felt smaller than David expected. He sat behind his lawyer, watching as Linda and her attorney whispered frantically at their table. The past 6 months had been exhausting, but today would finally bring some closure. The judge entered and everyone stood. Judge Patricia Morrison had a reputation for being fair but stern. She looked over her glasses at both parties before sitting down and opening the case file. David's lawyer presented the evidence methodically. Security footage showing Linda entering his home repeatedly over 2 weeks. Bank statements proving she'd ordered furniture and groceries using a credit card she'd stolen from his desk. Testimony from neighbors who'd attended dinner parties at his mansion, though most claimed they thought Linda had permission. What struck David most was watching Linda's face as each piece of evidence was shown. She didn't look ashamed or regretful. She looked annoyed, like this whole trial was an inconvenience interrupting her important work. When Linda took the stand, Her lawyer tried to paint her as a dedicated community servant who'd made an honest mistake. She talked about her 30 years in the neighborhood, her volunteer work, her commitment to maintaining property values. Then the prosecutor began cross-examination. He asked about the forged documents. Linda claimed she'd truly believed David had given her permission through email, even though forensic experts proved she'd created those emails herself. He asked about the jewelry. Linda said she'd found it lying around and put it on for safekeeping. David felt his jaw clench. That jewelry had belonged to his mother, kept in a locked safe. Linda had somehow cracked the combination. He asked about the credit card fraud. Linda insisted she'd found the card and planned to return it after using it for emergency household expenses. She'd spent over $8,000. The most damaging moment came when the prosecutor asked why she'd called the police on David in his own home. Linda's answer shocked the courtroom. He wasn't supposed to be there, she said simply. He told everyone he'd be gone for 2 months. I had plans. His early return disrupted everything. The prosecutor let that statement hang in the air. Even Linda's own lawyer looked uncomfortable. So you believed you had the right to occupy his home because he was supposed to be traveling? The prosecutor asked. As HOA president, I have certain authorities, Linda replied, her chin raised. Vacant homes are a security risk. I was protecting the neighborhood. David noticed several jury members exchanging glances. One woman actually shook her head slightly. The trial lasted 3 days. Various witnesses testified. The security expert who'd examined David's safe explained that Linda had hired a locksmith, claiming to be the homeowner who'd forgotten the combination. The locksmith, feeling terrible, confirmed he'd opened the safe for her. Rachel Kim, the HOA board member who'd helped expose Linda's other schemes, testified about discovering Linda had been embezzling HOA funds for years. She'd been creating fake invoices for landscaping work that never happened, pocketing the difference. A forensic accountant revealed Linda had stolen nearly $60,000 from the HOA over 5 years. She'd used some of that money to fund her lifestyle, including expensive dinners and shopping trips. One of the most powerful testimonies came from Gerald Patterson, an elderly widower in the community. He explained how Linda had convinced him to give her power of attorney while he recovered from surgery, then tried to pressure him into selling his home below market value to her daughter. David watched Linda during Gerald's testimony. She stared straight ahead, her expression blank as if none of this concerned her. When it was David's turn to testify, he kept his emotions in check. He described coming home that night, the shock of finding strangers in his house, the violation of seeing his mother's jewelry on Linda's neck. The things she took could be replaced, David said quietly, but she wore my mother's necklace. My mother passed away 2 years ago. That necklace was the last gift I gave her before she died. Seeing it on Linda felt like my mother was being violated all over again. Several jury members looked visibly moved. Linda's expression didn't change. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. When they returned, the forewoman stood and read the verdict. Guilty on all counts: criminal trespassing, burglary, fraud, identity theft, and embezzlement. Linda's face finally cracked. She looked genuinely shocked, as if she'd truly believed she'd done nothing wrong. The sentencing hearing happened 2 weeks later. Linda's lawyer pleaded for leniency, citing her age, her community service, her lack of prior criminal record. Judge Morrison listened patiently, then delivered her ruling. 3 years in prison, with possibility of parole after 18 months, full restitution to David and the HOA, a permanent restraining order preventing Linda from contacting David or entering the community ever again. Ms. Hutchinson, the judge said, looking directly at Linda, you violated not just the law but the trust of an entire community. You used your position of authority to exploit and steal from the very people who elected you to protect their interests. Your actions show a stunning lack of remorse and a dangerous sense of entitlement. Perhaps time in prison will help you understand that no position, no matter how important you believe it to be, places you above the law. Linda was led away in handcuffs. She didn't look back at her family sitting in the gallery. The civil suits took longer to resolve. David sued Linda for damages beyond restitution. The HOA filed their own lawsuit. Linda's assets were frozen. Her house eventually sold to cover the judgments. David used his portion of the settlement to establish a community fund, helping elderly residents avoid financial exploitation. He named it after Gerald Patterson, who'd become an unlikely friend through the whole ordeal. The neighborhood slowly healed. A new HOA board was elected, this time with actual oversight and accountability measures. Rachel became president and immediately implemented financial audits and term limits. David had his locks changed and installed a more sophisticated security system. He also got a large dog, a gentle golden retriever named Buster who barked at strangers but loved everyone once properly introduced. Sometimes David thought about that night he came home early. How different things might have been if his meeting had been rescheduled as planned. Linda might have finished her 2 weeks and disappeared, covering her tracks. The embezzlement might have continued for years, but he'd come home early. He'd caught her red-handed, and because of that, an entire community was protected from further harm. On the 1-year anniversary of Linda's arrest, the neighborhood held a block party. It was the first community event without Linda's controlling presence in decades. People actually relaxed, laughed, enjoyed themselves without worrying about violating some obscure HOA rule. David stood in his backyard, Buster at his side, watching his neighbors celebrate. Gerald approached with 2 glasses of lemonade. "Beautiful evening," Gerald said, handing David a glass. "It really is," David agreed. They stood in comfortable silence, watching children play in the street without being shooed away for disturbing the peace, watching neighbors chat freely without looking over their shoulders, watching a community finally feel like home. Linda would be released eventually, but she'd never return here. This neighborhood had learned its lesson about giving anyone too much power without accountability. They'd learned that titles and positions don't grant unlimited authority. They'd learned that sometimes the biggest threats come from those who claim to be protecting you. David raised his glass. Gerald understood without words being spoken. They clinked their glasses together, toasting to justice, to community, and to the simple freedom of coming home to a house that was truly yours. The sun set over the neighborhood, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Somewhere in the distance, someone started playing music. People began to dance, and for the first time in a very long time, the community felt genuinely peaceful. David smiled. He was finally home. 18 months passed faster than David expected. He was in his home office reviewing contracts when his phone rang. It was Rachel from the HOA board. "David, I wanted to give you a heads up," she said, her voice tense. "Linda was released yesterday. Early parole for good behavior." David felt his stomach drop. He knew this day would come, but somehow he'd pushed it to the back of his mind. "Does she know about the restraining order?" "Yes, her parole officer made it very clear. She's not allowed within 500 feet of you or anywhere in our neighborhood, but I thought you should know she's out." That night, David couldn't sleep. Buster sensed his anxiety and stayed close, resting his head on David's lap. He kept checking his security cameras, half expecting to see Linda's face appear on one of the screens. The next morning, David received an email from an address he didn't recognize. The subject line read, "We need to talk." Against his better judgment, he opened it. The message was from Linda's daughter, Christine. She apologized for reaching out, but said her mother was struggling with reintegration and wanted to apologize to David in person. Christine claimed Linda had done a lot of therapy in prison and understood the harm she'd caused. David stared at the email for a long time. Part of him wanted to delete it and move on, but another part wondered if closure might actually help both of them. He forwarded the email to his lawyer, who immediately called him. "Absolutely not," his lawyer said firmly. "This could be a trap. Linda violated you in the worst way possible. You owe her nothing." "I know," David replied. "But what if she really has changed? What if this could help her move forward?" "David, people like Linda don't change. They just get better at manipulation." Despite the warning, David couldn't shake the feeling. He decided to respond to Christine, agreeing to meet in a public place with his lawyer present. They settled on a coffee shop downtown, far from David's neighborhood. The meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday at 2 in the afternoon. David arrived early with his lawyer and chose a table near the window where they could see everyone coming and going. Linda arrived exactly on time. David barely recognized her. She'd lost weight. Her hair had gone completely gray, and she walked with a slight stoop that hadn't been there before. Prison had aged her 10 years. Christine was with her, along with a woman who introduced herself as Linda's therapist. They sat down across from David, and for a moment nobody spoke. Linda looked at David, and he saw something in her eyes he'd never seen before. It looked like genuine shame. "Thank you for meeting me," Linda said quietly. Her voice was different too, softer, less commanding. "I know I don't deserve your time." David waited. He wasn't going to make this easy. "I've spent the last 18 months thinking about what I did," Linda continued. "In therapy, I had to face some hard truths about myself. I was a bully. I was a thief. I violated your home and your trust in ways I can never take back." She paused, her hands shaking slightly. "For years, I told myself I was protecting the neighborhood, that I was keeping standards high. But the truth is I was drunk on power. I liked controlling people. I liked making them afraid of me. And when you weren't there, when your house was empty, I saw an opportunity to take something that wasn't mine." Christine reached over and squeezed her mother's hand. Linda took a deep breath and continued. "There's no excuse for what I did. None. I wore your mother's jewelry and I knew exactly what I was doing. I knew those pieces were precious to you. Part of me wanted to hurt you, even though you'd never done anything to me. I think I resented you for being successful, for being young, for having your whole life ahead of you." David felt his throat tighten. He hadn't expected such raw honesty. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," Linda said. "I don't deserve it. I'm just asking you to know that I understand now. I understand the pain I caused, and I'm truly deeply sorry." The coffee shop bustled around them, but their table felt suspended in its own quiet bubble. David looked at this broken woman across from him and tried to reconcile her with the arrogant, entitled person who'd thrown dinner parties in his home. "Why did you really do it?" David asked. "The truth." Linda was quiet for a long moment. "My husband left me 3 years before all this happened. He said I'd become impossible to live with. Too controlling, too critical. I threw myself into the HOA because it gave me purpose. It made me feel important, but it wasn't enough. I was lonely and I was angry, and when I walked past your beautiful home day after day, something twisted inside me. I started fantasizing about living there, about being you, and then one day I just walked in. And it felt good. It felt powerful. So I kept doing it." "You stole $60,000 from the HOA, David said. "You tried to exploit Gerald. It wasn't just about me." "No, it wasn't," Linda admitted. "Once I started, I couldn't stop. Every time I got away with something, I felt invincible. I thought rules didn't apply to me because I was the one enforcing them. I see now how sick that thinking was." David's lawyer leaned forward. "What do you want from this meeting, Linda?" "Nothing," Linda said. "I just wanted David to hear me say I'm sorry. I wanted him to know that what I did wasn't his fault. He didn't deserve any of it. Nobody in that neighborhood deserved what I put them through." Christine spoke up for the first time. "My mother's living with me now. She's working as a cashier at a grocery store. She attends therapy twice a week and goes to a support group for people dealing with control issues. She knows she'll never be able to undo what she did, but she's trying to be better." David studied Linda's face. She looked exhausted, defeated, but also somehow lighter than before, like a weight had been lifted by finally admitting the truth. "I accept your apology," David said slowly. "Not because it fixes anything, but because I believe you mean it. What you did changed me. I have trust issues now. I check my security cameras obsessively. Sometimes I come home and still feel anxious walking through my own door." Linda's eyes filled with tears. "I'm so sorry. But I'm working through it," David continued. "And maybe you telling me the truth today helps a little. Maybe it helps me understand that it really wasn't about me. It was about your issues, your problems." They talked for another 20 minutes.